Okay, so welcome everyone to this first big meeting of the Kenyan Land Center for this term, in which we have the privilege of having Lewis Dijkstra with us, who is a regular visitor. And he's going to be speaking about the small matter of global urbanization for a very short period of time, between 1950 and 2100, so the end of this century. Just a mere 150 years. And why? Well, he will tell you why in a moment, but I'll tell you why he's here. It's not that he is a fellow, a professorial fellow, I think, at the Department of Geography, but he's one of the most influential thinkers on economic development coming from practice. He's been working at the European Commission for quite some time. In fact, almost a lifetime now. And in that period there, he has been the one that, in my view, has been the most innovative sort of decision maker in terms of how we think about territorial development and territorial dimensions. I think we in academia have a lot to thank Lewis, because he is the driving force behind ideas of how to, for example, introduce the whole idea of institutional quality in economic development. How do we measure institutions? He has been fundamental in driving ideas of entrapment, in driving the idea of how we do consider the problems of development trap and how that affects development and societies. He has been one of the main drivers of thinking at the forefront of shrinking cities and why some places become and stagnate. And of course, as he can show us, he has been driving not just the European Union, but the whole world through his work with the UN on what do we define as a city? What is a city? What is a semi-urban or peri-urban area? What is a rural town? And that is fundamental because it has significant implications on how we define not just theory, but empirical analysis, and eventually how it trickles down to policy through evidence-based research. So it's a real privilege to have you here. I'm sure he's going to have, I'm thankful to all of you for being here with him. To all of you watching from home, please keep on watching. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Lewis, who is going to be talking about this 150 years of global urbanization. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. It's really bit tall for this microphone, but tell me if you can't hear me, and also online complain loudly.
You can probably use the roaming one.
The roaming one works as well?
That's right.
Okay, great. I'll take the roaming one. So yeah, I want to talk about this because this is something that we've produced November, published it last year. It's been a long time coming. And it's not my work. It's definitely joint work. We have multiple units at the Joint Research Center where I work now. It's part of the European Commission. So we have multiple teams. We have my own team who works on territorial development, but we also have a team working on disaster risk management and global human settlement layer. We have a team that works on demography and migration. They've all contributed to this. And it was in cooperation with the UN Population Division. And so big thanks also to them for supporting this work. And the whole, what you will see now started from a short conversation I had with John Wilmoth in 2020. So, and now 6 years later, we have a rather large project. Before I go into the detail, just want to give you an idea of the magnitude of this project. So what we have produced is we have produced population grids and built up area grids and degree of urbanization grids for the entire globe at the grid cell level. Now, how many grid cells are there in the world? I think it's something like 140 million. And so we have data for 140 million grid cells for 25 years for 3 indicators, population built up and degree of urbanization. So we produced 10 billion data points. We didn't look at every single one of them, but we did want to make sure that they told a plausible picture. So we have tortured this data for a long period of time. So the World Urbanization Prospects is something that the UN puts out. And last year they published the latest edition. They were even thinking about discontinuing it. The UN, as you may have seen, is a bit in a tight spot right now. Some of the funders are not such big fans, and so a lot of staff is not being replaced and really limits their capacity to continue produce global reference data. But there was such an outcry when they said they were thinking about stopping this particular report that they said, okay, now we will continue with this. But rather than basing it purely on national definitions, we propose to also estimate something using a harmonized definition of the degree of urbanization, which had been approved by the UN Statistical Commission in 2020. So together we thought, okay, let's see if we can do this in a way that makes more sense. Now, urbanization is important. Talk a lot about it. It has lots of implications for the economy, for demography, for environment, but different countries define it in very, very different ways. They can use administrative status. You know, if you're a regional capital or provincial capital, then you're definitely a city, even if you may only have, you know, a couple of hundred inhabitants. Population size thresholds, very common. Denmark says 200 people, you're urban. Japan says, well, how about 50,000? So we use the same words, but we mean different things. And that really makes it very difficult to compare. So this was also one of the big criticisms of the World Urbanization Prospects. You're using different definitions and assuming that they are similar enough. So we really wanted to change that. And so we've made a lot of effort to do this harmonization. So if you look back, they started off with settlements of 20,000 in the 1963 version of the UN, and then they switched to agglomerated population. Then they had Geopolis and GRUMP, Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, but all these things didn't essentially, I mean, they were still building on what countries were telling them, right? They said, oh, we have a settlement here, we have a settlement there, but nobody agreed what the settlement actually was and how you could define that. The World Bank was also frustrated with this. They came up with an agglomeration index, which was quite nice, but it started from an external list of cities. So a country would say, we have 5 cities of 250,000 or more, they're here, and then the World Bank would draw a boundary around those points. But if the city forgot a city to add to that list, the World Bank couldn't add it, right? So if the city turned out in their methodology to be too small, they could take it away, but they couldn't add it. And this is a flaw, or this is a problem with many definitions. Solly Angel, for example, from NYU, also has an approach to create definitions of cities and towns. But again, it requires somebody else to tell the system there's a settlement, there's a city, and we're not doing that. So then first with the OECD, we came up with a functional urban area definition, cities plus commuting zones, and then we came up with the degree of urbanization. We developed it for Europe back in 2014, but we have then started applying it to the globe, thinking, okay, maybe this could work. In the Quito conference of the UN Habitat, we said, why don't we develop a global definition of a city? It could be useful. Let's agree on what a city is. How hard can it be? It wasn't just the EU, but also the FAO, UN Habitat, ILO, World Bank, OECD joined the efforts. And our expectation was that the density thresholds and the size thresholds we were using in Europe would have to be modified. So we went and say, okay, working with a grid is helpful. Let's see how we have to change this. And so we went to South Africa, went to Brazil, we went to Vietnam, went to Thailand, talked to everybody, and we showed them the maps, and they were like, no, it's okay. Just, it's fine. Don't touch it. And we were a bit surprised, pleased, but surprised that the density thresholds we had developed for, let's be honest, a very small and atypical part of the world, Europe, actually also worked in these other places. So then we did a big consultation round. We consulted over 100 countries on the degree of urbanization, showing them our estimates, saying, do you like this? Do we need to change this? And the overwhelming reply was, actually, this works better than our own definitions. Even the US Census Bureau said, person who's now unfortunately retired, but he said that he thought this method actually had some benefits compared to one of the many definitions that they use in the US. So we got very positive feedback. And then that's when the UN Statistical Commission said, okay, we're going to endorse this for statistical comparisons. You don't have to get rid of your national definitions. You can use more data for your national definitions, different data. You can use different methodologies. You can tweak it for your policies. National definitions aren't wrong, but they are national and they're not designed for international comparison, right? So here are some examples. One of the big shifts also is urban-rural is a typical dichotomy. So the world is not black and white, and nor is it either purely urban nor purely rural. So we tried to shift away from that dichotomy to more of a continuum. We have cities, towns, and semi-dense area. Rural areas, you can see a couple of pictures on the top from high-income countries or some low and middle-income countries as examples at the bottom. Now, how do we define those? At the basis is a population grid. So little squares 1 by 1 kilometer, and then we check, first we check what's the density of the cells, and then we check the population in all the cells that are touching, that are contiguous.
Sorry, I just read, the online people told me they couldn't
They
see
can't.
the PowerPoint, so.
So above a density threshold, connect all the cells, check total population. So a city consists of cells with a density of 1,500, and then all those cells together have at least 50,000 people. So that's it in a nutshell. I was quite pleased that we had a definition that I could explain on the back of an envelope. And then for towns and semi-dense, we lower the density threshold to 300, lower the size threshold to 5,000, and the remainder are rural areas. This is quite nice, but if you look at the name, towns and semi-dense, it already suggests it's more than one thing. So together with FAO, we wanted to create differentiation in rural. So we came up with the definition of villages and dispersed rural areas. And we wanted to split the semi-dense areas from the towns. So we have a definition of towns, semi-dense towns, and suburban or peri-urban area. I want to highlight that this yellow area, peri-urban, sometimes will look incredibly rural. Now, if you go to Africa, you'll see some of these areas. They might be quite far from a city. They might be quite agriculturally dominated, but they have a far higher density than these areas. So it's really, think of it in some countries as dense rural almost. Don't think of it as a city. Now, when we compare this data, you'll see that the little black line is what the country's statistical offices tell the UN. So we have countries like in the Americas and Europe that have a very, I call it broad or expansive or generous definition of urban. It can be a city, but it can be a town, it can even be like a suburban area. Sometimes even villages are included in urban. Think of that settlement of 200 inhabitants in Denmark. It's urban according to them, but maybe not according to everybody else. Then you have some places that are more restrictive, that have a narrow, a less all-encompassing definition of urban. And there you see that they tend to concentrate in Africa and Southern Asia. India is a notable example. So we did this all work together, Joint Research Center working with the Statistics Division and National Statistical Offices. In Europe, we're already producing official data by degree of urbanization, but the goal here was to come up with a long time series and projection and estimates for a period of 150 years. The criticisms of the past were of the lack of a consistent and replicable definition. And this is what the big innovation is here. I mean, these are some slides that I took from a presentation from the UN Pop Division. And really, I want to emphasize the consistency and transparency. Everything we've done, you can reproduce. The code is published. There are no manual adjustments. The definition is the same in 1950, today, and 2100, right? If you look at national definitions, what countries actually do is they don't send a time series. The UN asks how urban are you today? And they say, oh, we think we're about 50%. And then next year, they may have changed their definition and they say, oh, now we're 70%. And then they change it again. Oh, no, we're 40% urban. And so they just record all those different shares, but the underlying definition is changing and it's not mapped. This time, we give you a boundary for every single city. You don't get a single map in the past. So that's a big difference. And the fact that you can compare this across time and across space is the real innovation. They tried to get city lists in the past, but they would only do it for very large ones. So 300,000 plus cities. Now we have every single city defined as by the degree of urbanization, 12,000 of them. We found them and we track them across time. We've also added land and built up area to the data set, things that the UN was never able to collect in the past. They also collected national definitions, but because they had the harmonized definitions, they were saying, okay, we've tried in the past to harmonize, to try and backcast the current definition in the past for each country. And they said, we're not going to do that anymore because we're not confident we can do it reliably. They also gave up on the data collection on individual cities or agglomerations because they said, if you want consistent data, use the international definition. And we see also an increasing number of national statistical offices starting to produce data by degree of urbanization. We had recently a workshop in Mozambique with 2 national ministers present to really endorse this and see how this can be applied. So let's get into the actual projections. This is what we have estimated for the globe. So you can see these are the cities, villages, the towns, the semi-dense areas, and the dispersed rural areas. On the vertical, you can see the billions. So we started back in the 50s with only 2.5 billion. We're going to reach about 10 billion in 2070, and then it's starting to shrink. And you can see the percentages change as well. So you can see both the absolute and the relative trends here. We see that global population quadruples in the UN projections. Most people think that they're a bit optimistic in terms of fertility, so we might never make it to 10 billion, let's see. But then it starts to shrink. And there everybody is quite in agreement is if you look at fertility rates, we're going to shrink. If you look at age structures, we're going to shrink. The EU is, almost starting to shrink. Natural change has been negative for a long time. And many other countries are in the same situation. But if you look at city population, it doubles between 1950 and today, the share of it. So we go from 22% to 45% between 1950 and 2020. So a big increase. But as the population growth slows down, this increase in the city share also slows down. A lot of urbanization was driven by population growth, right? Rural share halves between 1950 and today, and it continues to slowly shrink. We have some reduction in the dense towns, while we see an increase in what can be suburbanization or peri-urbanization. How did we create that simple chart that I just showed you? We had observed data in the middle. From 1975 and 2020, we used a combination of remote sensing, satellite data. We tried to detect every building, building footprints. We tried to detect building heights. We tried to understand if they were commercial, industrial buildings or more residential. And so there we have a time series, 45 years using satellite imagery and census data from the finest population data that we could find. We took it from Columbia University, CISN, gridded population of the world. To go back, we backcast it on the relationship between national data and harmonized data, and we developed a model. I won't go into too much detail of the model, but I just want to give you a flavor. So for the fans, we used the mixed effects model to estimate 5-year population change for each of the classes of degree of urbanization, taking into account national population growth and population share in nationally defined urban areas. And we used a specific country estimator. And so that was then used to backcast that population by degree of urbanization for each of the classes, and we scale every 5 years to make sure the totals add up. We also linked our cities to the individual urban agglomeration data that the UN collected in the past to backcast as data for individual cities. So we actually have city population from 1950 for every single population. This is the core of the data series. We have improved it compared to the release we had in 2023, but all the data is online and can be visualized and analyzed. Now, in short, the CRISP model, it's something that we built on top of a model called 2UP, which was developed by the Dutch Environmental Agency and the Free University of Amsterdam. And we massively changed it. It used to be a binary model, urban, non-urban. We made it continuous. We increased the resolution. We increased the time span. And so we had a relatively simple mechanism. We wanted first to project population and built up area at the subnational area. Some countries are quite large, think of the US, China, projecting population and built up area change for the entire country, maybe not the most interesting thing. So we created 1,000 functional areas. These are large areas around the main cities, and they cover the entire territory. And so if you have a part of the country, like in Italy, the south is growing less quickly than in the north, that is taken into account. And those patterns slowly converge towards the future. Once we have those projections at the functional area level, we just have to jump from those 1,000 functional areas to the 140 million grid cells. Easy peasy. How do you do that? We look at where do people tend to live? What are the characteristics of places where people tend to live? How far they are from a road? How far are they from a city? What is the terrain? What's the altitude, the temperature? And we took a whole bunch of indicators to understand what's the most suitable area for future built up, taking into account what is there today. So with that suitability matrix, we could allocate built up. Then we could reduce population in less attractive locations. In some places, population actually shrinks, increasingly so in the future. And then we first allocate population to the newly built up area and then to other areas. Paul.
Do you include projected climate change? Some places may become uninhabitable.
We have kept the climate constant and we have kept the sea level where it is today. But we want to apply the SSP scenarios, the shared socioeconomic pathways of the IPCC, and then we could also play with environmental indicators and projections of sea level rise or temperature change. But this is something that we still want to do. So we have allocated new buildings. We put people in those buildings, take into account how many people typically live in a building of that size in that area. We limit the amount of increase that you can have in one time step. If we have more population left, we allocate it to other suitable areas. And then we apply the degree of urbanization. And we do this every 5 years. So we reiterate the process. The thing I want to emphasize is that it's an iterative model. We take into account the distance to a village, to a town, to a city, and we update that every year. So if your town becomes a city, then we take into account, oh, actually, there's a bigger concentration of population here. We take into account how much built up is there now, or in 5 years, or in 10 years, what's the density? So it really, I wouldn't say it learns, but it's not a passive projection of today. It really changes over time. So if a country has a lot of population growth, you'll see more cities appearing. If it's shrinking, you'll see a lot of cities slowly becoming towns. And so what do you get in terms of results? You get a shift from a world in the 50s where very few people lived in a city, and the majority lived either in a rural area or in a town. And as time went by, you can see those cities overtaking those other areas. Cities overtook rural areas in 1975, and they overtook towns and semi-dense areas in 1996. So for the past 30 years, cities have been the dominant place of where the majority, where most people live compared to those other two classes. And we will see, rural areas are flatlining and they're going to start shrinking over time. You can take a look at different parts of the world. These are the UN sub-region, the SDG regions. And you can see, some places were already quite urban, have become far more urban. And you see that towns and semi-dense are somewhere in between. They are more popular in rural areas, but less popular in cities. So they tend to grow, but not as quickly. But there's quite different patterns between the different parts. I think it's really important that we can look at this continuum because there's a lot of debate about rural development. There's a lot of debate about urban development. But when we talk about urban development, they really mean the big cities, right? Even going down to a city of 100,000, is that really urban development? And then you've got all these towns between 5 and 50,000 that get overlooked, or these peri-urban areas. So they are often quite important. We see, for example, in Europe that often towns will provide services for a much wider area. They're kind of market towns, service access places. So with this method, we can identify those places, and that's how we can understand their function and see how policies should take that into account. Now, if you look at the comparison of the trend with national definition, you'll see that broad definition pattern and that narrow definition pattern popping up again. But both really show the same shift towards urban living, the same transition. If you look at the global shares of national urban, they go from 30% to 60% roughly. And if you look at cities, they go from 20 to 45, and cities plus dense towns, you go from 43 to 58. So that's actually quite similar, but the distribution doesn't follow the same pattern. So if you look here, the degree of urbanization, if we add everything up to semi-dense as urban, it mirrors quite closely what the national definitions say. But if you look at, say, sub-Saharan Africa, what they call urban is primarily cities. Slowly, dense towns start to be added. Also, this is primarily India. Now, India has a curious definition of urban. It's not only about how many people live there and how close they live together, it's also about what they do. If too many people work in agriculture, then it doesn't matter if there's 100 or 200 or 300,000 people, it's rural. So they did a small test. This is the national definition that they applied in 2011. If you drop that criteria of agricultural employment, what happens to the urbanization rate of India? The official rate in 2011 was 32%. Don't know if you've been to India, but they have some cities. If you drop that criteria, it jumps from 32 to 70%. So it's that one choice to limit it to the places that don't have a lot of agricultural employment, which explains why this line is there and not there. So it really underlines that definitions matter. One criteria can change how we see a country or even the world. Here you get a zoom. And so India, no, they don't even include all their cities in what they call urban. We've also done an intersection. A few dense towns pop in here, but it's a very restricted definition. China, on the other hand, we've done a comparison also with theirs. Their definition has changed a couple of times. You see little bumps here. Some of that was the big leap forward, which wasn't going forward, but I digress. But today, if you look at the data, they typically match cities and dense towns and increasingly even semi-dense and semi-dense areas. So the Chinese definition over time has come closer to what we define as a city plus a town in the degree of urbanization. Just making sure I'm not waffling on for all too long. So what we see is increasingly countries become dominated by city living. And I think it's really, we use city and urban often as a synonym. I'm trying to convince people, maybe even the world, to think of those as different things. But it's not so easy to convince people that towns are different because check in your language. If you don't have a word for town, but you have a word for city and village, raise your hand. You have a couple more non-English speakers, right? In French, in Italian, in Spanish, in German, in Dutch, in Swedish, I know we don't have a word for town. We have villages and cities and nothing in between. So it's a bit of a challenge to tell people, well, so the French are like, what do you mean? Oh, you mean small cities? Okay, for lack of a better word. But it's, by trying to define the words we use, we make sure that when we talk to somebody from a different country with a different language and culture, we still mean the same things. But what you can see in these maps is that you see a lot of places that were dominated by rural living or living in towns and semi-dense areas, and over time, more and more are shifting to city living, right? Now, I could give a very simple positive spin to my work and hide some of the maybe flaws or the things we're criticized for under the carpet. But it's an academic setting, so I thought let's be a bit more honest. And this is one of the things we have been heavily criticized for. So Rwanda tells the world we're 70% rural. If you apply the degree of urbanization and only look at the classes in rural, our conclusion is it's 6%. That's not a lot. So people look at this and say, this is ridiculous, this is so wrong, how could anybody take this seriously? Our data for Rwanda is not very good, not because we didn't try, it's just because there's not very good data for Rwanda. But I don't think it's wrong, and let me try and persuade you. We say never use the dichotomy, think about the continuum. So if we look inside this class, we actually see only 14% of the population of Rwanda lives in a city. That's quite low. Now, if you look globally, 45% lives in cities. So actually, from a city perspective, Rwanda is an outlier, right? It's a very small share of its population living in cities. And then you've got 80% in these towns and semi-dense areas. Global, that's 36%. So this is where the majority of their population live. You can split it out. 55% lives in semi-dense areas, these peri-urban areas, compared to 19% globally. So I think if you look into detail, you can actually see that our method doesn't come up with a dichotomy that people recognize, but as soon as you switch to the 3 or the 7 classes and compare to that to the global level, you get a pattern that people do recognize, and also that people in Rwanda recognize, right? So I think it's an unfair accusation, and it's better to have a more nuanced understanding of urbanization. Now let's take a look at individual cities, because I find it exciting, but it's not so easy. It being late at night, dark outside, I thought, let's show you some colorful animations. This is Delhi in India, and we only have grid level data from 75, so it starts in 75. But here you can see the degree of urbanization changing up to 2100. And here you can see the population distribution by degree of urbanization again. It's massive changes, right? So we start with around 12 million and we go up to almost 60 million in this little square. Now, we have a bit of a problem when we want to analyze cities across time. If you analyze countries across time, you assume their boundaries are fixed. In most cases, that's true, and otherwise, there were some changes, but we typically re-estimate them with fixed boundaries. Now, the problem with cities is they don't have fixed boundaries. They can grow, they can shrink, they can merge, they can split, and it creates a bit of a headache. Just to give you an idea, so we have to have a method to deal with mergers and splits. So we have more than 300,000 transitions in this data set of our cities here. And we have 35,000 transitions, which are either cities that merge or split. And that is difficult because then what do you do? And the thing I want to emphasize here, for smaller cities, not so many merge and almost none of them split. They may be born, they may die, but they don't really do this. But the bigger ones, over 1 million, over 1/3 of transition involves merger, and also 3% involves split. So if you want to follow a city, what can you do? This was a headache for a long time. We didn't have very good solutions. You can have, if a city merges, you can have both cities die and a new one is born. Not so useful if you're trying to analyze things across time because we get a break, right? You can have the smaller city die and the bigger one absorb that population. But then if you look at, your curve like, again, that other city didn't really die. Those people were living in the city. They're still living in the city, but then, now a city that's been joined. You can fix boundaries, but if you're doing that over 150 years, you're saying, well, this is the boundary of the city in 1950 and 2000, today in 2100. Again, not very realistic. And one of the problems with fixed boundaries is the amount of land in your city doesn't change. Strange. Land in the city does change. And it also means that your population change equals your density change. Again, not ideal. We tested one method where we would use the current boundaries, and going back in time, we would take out the bits that weren't part of a city yet. So a city could shrink going back in time or grow going forward in time. The problem was sometimes cities shrink. Over time, they will get smaller, the population shrinks. So that didn't work very well. So we came up with a solution where we take a reference here. I'm trying to explain it here. We take a reference here. Here we took 2025. This is the easy one. It's a one-to-one relationship. Love those. It was smaller in the past. It's bigger in the future. Sometimes it shifts a little bit, but that's easy. One-to-one. Nothing to decide. Here you have a split. This city, 2025, peak population, it was smaller in the past, it started shrinking in the future, and so you've got two cities. So what we do to make sure that you have a continuous analysis, we give these two pieces the same ID. So we give them just the same ID, and when we ask what's the population of this city in the past, we sum those up. It means it's not contiguous, but it does mean you get a continuous time series that you can use. And it adds up to the city population as it would. For mergers, we do something different. We keep them apart. So for example, there were two cities in 2025. That means we want to have two cities in the past or in the future whenever they merge. And we then have to create an artificial split, and we do that with a little bit of gravity. So let me try and show you an example. This is Cairo. I hope that this works. Yeah. So you can see Cairo grow over time. And the definition doesn't allow the creation of contiguous cities. Cities are never contiguous. And what you can see here is there's a lot of contiguous cities. And that's because we have maintained all the cities that were split, all the cities that were there. Let's see, find it. Yeah, here. All these cities in 2025, this is our reference here. We keep them. We keep them alive, and then we allocate the new bits to one of those cities depending on the distance and the size. And that's how we can maintain a relationship across time that makes sense. And that's what you need to do if you want to be able to follow cities across time. So the UN was looking at the most populous cities. And so you can see, for example, it was Tokyo, 30 million in 2000, and then Jakarta became the biggest one. But these changes in population are also mirrored in changes in area, changes in built up, and changes in boundaries in the way I've shown. You can see Dhaka becoming much bigger over time. We've got quite a few headlines of, what's the biggest city in 2025? Wasn't most excited about those headlines, but it's one way of summarizing 5 years of work. Then we looked at the mega cities. We see an increase of the cities of more than 10 million. We only had 8 in 75, 33 today, and they are slowly increasing. The largest cities are in Africa and Asia, primarily. Biggest cities in Europe are Moscow and Istanbul. After that, London and then Paris. You can see some new ones emerging, in particular in Africa, where you see rapid population growth leading to rapid growth also in the biggest cities. But most people actually live in a small city. More of them live in a small or medium-sized city than live in a megacity. Megacities, people know their name, they're very famous, but they don't really capture that much of the population or the number of cities. And most cities have a population of less than 1 million. So here's a breakdown of that population, not just by urban and rural, but also by city size, right? And you can see back in 75, those 8 mega cities, 2.5% of the total population, whereas you had 12% in cities between 50 and 250,000. But over time, you see the increasing up here, and you see this slowly shrink. So we see a move to cities, and we see a move to bigger cities over time. We have new cities popping up in our projections, towns that become bigger and eventually become city. But most of the population change in cities is determined by what happens in cities that are already there. They add population through natural change, through migration. They expand, reclassifying some of the population that was already there, but also gaining space where they can add more population. So 3/4, roughly, of population change in cities happens in and around existing cities. Only 22% in the last 25 years is created by newly emerging cities. So I think we need to really think about how we accommodate growth in the cities we have, rather than pretending that adding a few new towns here and there will accommodate all the city growth that we are seeing in front of us. So we had some cities that grew very, very fast. Here they highlighted cities with an annual growth of 4% or more. This is breakneck speed for demographic growth. Demographic growth rarely happens that quickly. You see a couple of large ones, but you can see also quite a few small or very small cities that grew at this rate. Whereas a large city might have, not necessarily, but you could hope to have that it has a larger administration, some more administrative capacity to generate the right investments in infrastructure to guide this development in a way that allows people to have a high quality of life, good access to services, good access to employment. In the smaller places, that capacity might be entirely lacking. And so seeing these high growth rates in places where planning capacity and investment capacities are low is definitely worrying. Now, population growth is very asymmetric. And so, for example, we see that half the growth in city population is going to happen in these 7 countries over the next 25 years. So that's really, this is the rest of the world. And here you've got the 7 countries, which are going to have a lot of the population growth, but also a lot of the city population growth. And then the rural areas are barely growing, a little bit in DRC. Towns also far less growth than compared to cities. Some cities also shrink, and this can happen in the same country as though the population is growing. And so it's important to understand that growth and decline can coexist, and size doesn't necessarily always determine. You also have large cities that actually have been shrinking over time. There's also a lot of concern about urban sprawl and de-densifying. Actually, our data shows that most cities have been growing in density. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is even 80%. So there, that creates concerns about more crowding, less access to services, less access to infrastructure. Now, one of the things that we also need to consider is that this pattern of shrinkage is going to increase in the future. Already, a lot of countries are having a shrinking population. This tends to be faster in rural areas than cities, but as more and more countries start to shrink, more and more cities will start to shrink, and not just the small ones, also some of the big ones, right? You can see, for example, Tokyo in Japan has been shrinking in terms of population. Japan, one of the countries with very low fertility rates, and so Korea, you see shrinking cities there. One other thing I want to mention here is built up areas. So this is the amount of land covered by buildings that we try to measure with remote sensing. Often people focus on cities. Cities are polluted and dense and they're bad for the environment, whereas the countryside is green and the air is beautiful. But actually, if you look at the amount of buildings people use per capita, it's much higher in the countryside than in the cities. And it's been growing much faster in the countryside than the cities. So if we want to protect the environment, I would argue that cities are helpful. I try and explain this to some of my policymaking friends, but it's tricky because I'm trying to tell them that the most polluted places on earth are good for the environment. And it's this contradiction that a lot of people struggle with, but it's the efficiency of urban living. You need less land, you need less infrastructure, you need less energy to live because of scale economies. It does mean your air might not be very clean, and your life expectancy may suffer a little bit. Other people, it's really good if you live here. And I fear that sometimes we worry too much about cities being bad, and so we want to limit their growth, limit their density, and push people to stay in the countryside or move to the suburbs. And I don't think that's necessarily the best thing we can do for the climate or for the environment. And so this is a little bit the changes that we can see in built-up area per capita. And here, this is the entire country, and you can see these figures are much higher than the cities. And I do want to point out, in sub-Saharan Africa, you even see a reduction of the amount of built-up area per capita. These places don't have a lot of built-up per capita to start with. They're seeing rapid growth in population. And the fact that the construction can't keep up doesn't necessarily bode well for the amount of space that people have living there. Now, I told you about Rwanda. Now, I want to tell you about a non-existing megacity that again, this is warts and all, I'm trying to be relatively fair here. Hajipur is the city you've never heard of 10 million people in India. Why do we have such a massive city? So this is what it looks like in 2025. I would argue it's mostly a data artifact. We have very coarse data for India back in 2011, where population change is even coarser, and we end up combining a lot of cities into a single one. But I think if we had finer data, and this is the situation in 2005, we would see much more concentrated population change, and all those cities wouldn't necessarily blend together. So is our data, is this a city truly a city of 10 million? No. It's the best we could do. And I know that India is finally doing its population census, and I hope they will share. No, still not. Oh, man. I keep hoping they will do a good census and create geocoded population grids, but well, I'll have to hope a little bit longer. So that's the story on the individual cities. Now, I want to do a little promotion. We have a workshop online webinar coming up at the end of the month, and you're all invited, and we're going to present our prototype of urban agglomerations. Now, talk to you for a long time about cities, suburbs. The difficulty is we don't connect them, right? What's an urban agglomeration? It basically is a city or a town and its own little suburban fringe. It's a very easy concept. This is from the UN. Some agglomerations have more cities. This is from UN Habitat, densely populated area, city center, and suburbs. So how hard can it be to create that, right? Well, let me show you. Sometimes it's easy. This is in Colorado, in the US. You got your city, you got your towns, you got your suburbs. Even a child can draw a little circle around those. This is Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent, and it gets a bit messy, right? Where do you draw the border? So we've come up with a method to try and do that. We do it in first 4 steps. We pick our cities and towns. We drop suburbs that are not contiguous. In high-income countries, you might want to call these exurbs. You know, in the US, you have these kind of suburban developments out in the middle of nowhere. We assign contiguous suburbs to a city. We drop suburbs that are too far, and then we decide which cities and towns should be combined in a polycentric agglomeration. Just a quick example. This is Boston. These are the towns and cities. And then we drop the non-contiguous suburbs. You see a few examples here in the red circle. Then we create monocentric agglomeration. That means each city, each town gets some suburbs. We take into account the population in those settlements. So big cities get more suburbs than small cities. Same goes for towns. We take into account also the density. The higher the density, we assume people can travel. We drop some suburbs, even though they're contiguous, but they're a bit too far away. So here you've got some suburbs, but those are just too small and too far away to really eat them up. So sometimes we drop some of those suburbs, and that's important because sometimes those suburbs, even if they're contiguous, continue forever. And then last, we combine some. So if you look very closely, we allow the big ones to eat up some of the small ones. So here you can see all these little monocentric agglomerations around towns at the edge of Boston got eaten up into a larger agglomeration. Now, this is a first prototype. We don't know if it's good enough, so we thought, we'll ask you. And so you can actually inspect every single agglomeration in the world, and we have 100,000 of them or more. And you can tell if it's too big, it's too small, it's too round, it's too square. And we'll try and modify the method to make sure that we get to results that are more to people's liking. I have an ongoing discussion in geography, and some people argue that, well, you come up with a definition and that's pure and that's objective and you're done. And I argue, well, we're trying to measure something that people see, people have opinions about. And so even if I have a perfectly internally consistent definition, that doesn't mean other people recognize it. It might have zero external validity. So this is an attempt to increase the external validity while maintaining the internal consistency of our work. Now, why do we want that? We have this concept of city and commuting zones, but we can't apply this across time. We don't have commuting data for multiple points in time. And this is something that we can apply to any year we have population grids for. So we can apply this from 75 up to 2100. And this gets me to my last point. Another criticism of the work we have been doing is that initially, if you look at the national population share in urban areas based on national definitions, you find this amazing correlation with GDP per capita. And now we do the degree of urbanization, and whether you do cities and towns, that correlation is zip, nada, gone. And so urban economists look at this, well, this must be wrong, right? Cities are good for growth. Cities are good for economic development. I actually tend to agree with that. Cities are more productive, they are more innovative. But some of the reasons we find this strong link is actually spurious. There are a lot of criteria in national definitions that make urban areas to be classified as rural. One example was India, but you have examples of certain level of services, certain income levels, certain economic structures, all of these things that tend to eat away at the urban share in less developed countries. And it's also true that where we see restricted definitions, they tend to be lower in terms of GDP per capita. But so we looked at our agglomerations. So we started here with the agglomerations of 5,000 people or more. We get an R squared of about 6%. Then we go to 50,000, R squared goes up to 8%. 100,000, we go up to 9%. And we go up to 250,000, and we go up to 9%, as you can see here. Now, this is just the start of an exploration. We want to do a much fine-grained analysis, seeing if there is a link between urban agglomerations and economic development, to reassure the urban economists that maybe our work is worth taking a look at. Okay. That brings me to the last few slides. I wanted to talk a little bit about policy recommendations and future research. We have been showing data on where people live, where housing is, where transport is. We can, when we know where services are, we can analyze how long it takes to get to those services. And this is really a plea to use not just the degree of urbanization, but also the population grids to help plan for investment road infrastructure, public transport and service locations, and to coordinate transport and housing in a meaningful way. Transport and digital links can help bridging some of those divides. And the other thing is, we do some European population projections, and in my previous jobs, we would talk to regional presidents and mayors, and whenever they were, we'd ask them, so, how's your population doing? All of them were convinced that they were going to be growing. Now, they can't all be, right? Some, were willing to acknowledge that it was shrinking, but they were going to change that. And again, it's very unlikely. So here is a plea that population projections, they're not, we can't see the future. They're not perfect. They're what-if scenarios under a number of assumptions, but they're much better than every local politician's guess about what's going to happen in the future, right? So think about those and use them, and think also about the age structure. We can see rapid changes in the number of people 50 plus, like myself, and a big reduction of the younger generation. So we're going to apparently need more hospitals and fewer schools, and that has, impacts also on how those communities perceive themselves. But think about those things. I want to make a plea again that cities, though polluted, are not very polluting. So let's think about that and really don't discourage city living. Lots of people would like to live here, but we have many policies in place that limit urban expansion, that limit the number of floors you could put on a building. And I think most of those are well-intentioned, but have horrible consequences for the environment and even for welfare. So here's a plea for more tall buildings where people want them, and less restrictive green belts in the world. And that's a legacy that you still see in too many places. I do think the degree of urbanization is useful. I wouldn't have worked on it for so long. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we had before. And I think it is very useful for comparison and international monitoring. Do think some cities are going to grow rapidly. Some cities are going to double in the decades to come in terms of population and area size, but many of them are going to be shrinking, and not just the small cities. I think the small cities might struggle the most, be it with growth or decline, because they just don't necessarily have that capacity. And urban expansion, we have a lot of discussions about urbanization in Africa not bringing a lot of economic benefits, but some of that may be because this is urbanization driven by people fleeing war-torn parts of their country, but also because some of those cities aren't very functional, right? The connections that you need to have a large labor market and specialization are simply just not there. I hope that we get more censuses and more geospatial data, not just in India, and use remote sensing to track land use change and built up area per capita. Then I'll stop. What's the plan of the research agenda? We want to apply, this is an idea from the UN Population Division, rather than applying our model to one projection, he wants us to apply it to 80 alternative population scenarios and see how much the outcome changes. I think it is quite useful. It's technically a bit challenging, but we're planning to do it. We want to validate our model, apply it to the shared socioeconomic pathways to inform the climate change community. We're going to estimate population by age and sex. And sex is actually a very important criteria there. In any country we've been able to look at, we see that young women prefer living in the city as compared to the countryside, and young men are a bit slow to catch on to that. Sex ratios are a bit unbalanced there. I would love to get better data, and any country that I talk to is like, please do a geocoded census and give me the data. Sometimes they listen, mostly they don't. And we're going to change the method we use to create population grids to improve the accuracy. It's called chain linking. I can tell you more afterwards if you want. And then the population division was also wanting us to connect the evolution of towns to cities. We want to revise our urban agglomeration. We're going to estimate new global functional urban areas with commuting. And the most ambitious part is we want to create a timestamped road network. Now, what's a timestamped road network? That for each road, you know when it was built. It's a simple question. It's really hard to answer. But we're going to use satellite imagery, historical maps, and all different things to try and come up with a road network that we know when it was built. Then we can create a travel friction map. And then we can create a time series of functional urban areas, not with commuting data, but estimating travel time back in time. That's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Lewis, for that very interesting presentation. I think it's probably raised quite a lot of questions and challenges. And rather than me having a dialogue with you, it's probably better if there are questions from the audience. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, go ahead again.
Thank you, Lewis, for the
Sure.
Thank you, Lewis, for the presentation. I was wondering, because there's a strong criteria on cell continuity, does it impact where you draw the grid? So when the population density kind of follows outside or inside the grid to then determine if that's a city or not a city?
By the way, I forgot to mention, say your name and which master's are you from?
My name is Miguel. I'm doing the Urbanization and Development Masters.
So to answer that question, we actually have a beautiful study done by the Swiss Statistical Office. So a grid cell of 1 kilometer, you can divide that up into 100 cells of 100 meter by 100 meter. So they apply the degree of urbanization 100 times to their grid cells by moving it up or down a grid cell and having different cells of 1 square kilometer. And their conclusion was that it doesn't change much. Especially for large cities, they're there. It doesn't really matter where the grid starts. But we are also trying to develop a method that we could apply at 100 meter. I think for cities, it doesn't matter, but for towns and villages, sometimes 1 kilometer is a big course. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a version that can also be applied to 100 meter. The challenge there is that, the good, the best can be an enemy of the good enough. And statistical offices are not willing to produce a 100 meter grid for the entire country. Not even very highly capable statistical institutes. So that will never be something we can use with official data. But the 1 kilometer grid, lots of countries are willing to produce. So long story short, I don't think it matters a lot for the cities where you start the grid. We can have a 100 meter version, but it won't be applied to official data.
Okay, more questions. There was a hand over here. Just say your name and
Okay, my name is Thomas Blackburn, in urban planning. I was wondering if in any of the assessment you've done about demographic change and the future of demography, if you've seen any impact of restrictive growth boundaries. You did mention briefly the green belt. If there's anything like a green belt policy that has done anything to sort population into town, village versus city, or had any impact on that. I know that those policies came about perhaps around the time that we started this, that you've mentioned here from 1950 to 2100, that those policies were coming about in the middle of the last century. So is there any, I know that's a really maybe difficult question to answer and very broad, but have you seen any impact of those kinds of policies on where population moved during this time period?
It's an excellent question. The difficulty we would have is finding out where these green belts or these protected areas are. We have some global data on national parks and state parks and environmentally protected areas. Those we can take into account, and we can also see what their impact has been on the past. The green belts, I don't know of a good source for enough countries to be able to cover it. But green belts are a bit tricky in the sense that if they're far enough away and permissive enough, and the population in the city doesn't grow very quickly, it doesn't matter. It could be there or it could not be there. It won't change anything. The difficulty with the green belt is that typically it takes a huge amount of effort to put it in place, and then nobody wants to change it. And in the places where you should be changing it, there's lots of people who are going to be earning quite a lot of money if it doesn't change because their house becomes more valuable, right? I think this is a very good example of a city where London, where this problem is there. So I wouldn't recommend green belts. I mean, I'm supportive of the idea that we over subsidize transportation and therefore the market will deliver densities that are too low. But in actual fact, we're often preventing densities to go as high as the market will bear. And green belts are a very crude mechanism to try and achieve that particular goal. I would rather have charges transport more, make it more expensive, or facilitate density going up. The worst cases of a green belt is that you can't grow out and you can't grow up. And again, London is a very good example of this, and your rent is also a very good indication of the consequences of this, right? If you wanted to have a green belt, you'd almost want to have like a pressure valve on it. If rents or property prices go above this, we expand it by default. But in general, I think it's a very crude instrument and I would recommend it.
Okay, Catherine.
Thank you so much for a really wonderful lecture. My name is Kathleen Archibaldrew, and I am studying local economic development. I'm not so familiar with the nature of this research, and I had an idea and wanted to know if it would be possible to implement this type of research. So for places where maybe there are not maps of, main roads, or from what I understand, that would be kind of a way to track migration patterns. Would it be possible to do some interviews to go to specific places and say, hey, where did you walk before? I'm coming from the perspective of a very small island, and until very recently, we didn't have, a very good map. So you just say, well, you go up by the tree and you turn and then you make a right by the church and then you're gonna be at Susan's house. So coming from that perspective, especially since the data goes back to 1950, would it be possible to do those kinds of interviews? Maybe it would help to kind of see how certain paths develop and why certain cities went into certain places where there aren't road data points.
Okay, Lewis.
Excellent question. I like thinking about this one. I mean, we do a lot of work also in incredibly data poor situations, and road networks are difficult to map in the sense that even the main roads, they're barely visible from space. So remote sensing is not really going to help you. You can do some things with, aerial photography, but that's typically quite expensive. Drones are making that a bit easier. One of the things that you can also do is you have OpenStreetMap, which is a collaborative effort. And there you can actually map streets yourself with your mobile phone, and you can add information. One of the examples that I really like is Copenhagen decided to partner with OSM. Instead of trying to make their own map better, they said, we're going to take OpenStreetMap and improve it and keep it in the public domain. And so that's, for me, a very good way of trying to understand where roads are now. And you can do the same with public transport. Where's my transit? They will have people take every bus in the city and map where it rides and how quickly and where it stops. With apps and GPS, there's a lot that's possible. For historical data series, it's harder. Road infrastructure is really the biggest challenge. The only source that I have found is historical maps, but even there, it's difficult to know how big that road is and what kind of speeds it would allow for. But there is a lot of knowledge stored in people even older than me. And they might know when roads were first opened or constructed. And if you have a small community, you might actually be able to find out, well, it used to take this long to get to that village, but now we can take this road, or they open this bridge and it makes things faster. So I think with interviews, especially of people, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, you can do really interesting work. So okay.
You have a question online?
Line, so yes, if you can ask it yourself.
Barbara in Brazil, and she asks, to what extent do agglomeration methodologies, you can just read it because it's very long. Yeah,
Online, so
To what extent do agglomeration methodologies risk naturalizing spatial configurations that are historically and politically produced rather than purely functional outcomes?
That's a beautiful question. My first degree is in political science, so I have a lot of sympathy for this question. We're not trying to map what should be there. We're trying to map what is there. And so we should be able to see the choices, the consequences of history and politics in space. And so we might find that some places are much smaller than you would expect, or far more constrained, or far bigger, right? There's a lot of debates about primacy and whether the capital city where the government is and where there's maybe a lot of backroom deals, is it way too big, in part because of corruption? All those things will be reflected in where we see buildings, where we see people, where we see transport connections. So I don't think we're trying to standardize the world. We're just trying to find out what configurations are out there. And even if you look at the agglomerations, you see massive differences, right? If you look at Latin America, you see a dense core of a city, and there's barely any suburban fringe. Then you go further north into North America or to Australia, and you see this tiny little dense city and these massive suburbs going on for miles, right? And that's what we're trying to capture in a way that allows us to still have a same method in different places. It's a tall order, but I think it can be done. And I don't think we're wiping away the impact of history and politics. On the contrary, we're trying to provide a mechanism that allows you to capture those differences and compare.
okay, you can see that the seminars in the Guiana Center are being followed all over the world. So people, instead of watching the Olympics in Brazil, they're just watching our seminars online. So please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sherry. I'm taking the Master's in Urbanization and Development. And apologies if I'm repeating something we already discussed a little bit earlier, but I'm from Jakarta, which is the biggest city in the world, but also, as many of us know, probably regularly kind of popularized as the fastest sinking megacity. And earlier you mentioned that the predictions for future urbanization trends don't account for, existing realities like climate change, like sea levels rising. For some cities like mine, more than others, climate change isn't just a threat, but is already a reality at our door. Floods are displacing hundreds to thousands annually in Jakarta. Perhaps this might not be present in the data, but on a personal level, how do you think these threats are going to affect urbanization patterns in not just the next 75 years, but maybe even in just the next 20? Thank you.
Okay, Lewis.
So part of my work is trying to create global data sets where we use global data. But another part of my work is actually talking to national governments and national statistical offices about the data. And so we recently had a workshop in Brazil discussing this method and comparing them to national definitions. And we've had the same with Indonesia. And also we got quite a few remarks from the Indonesian government. Is it really that big? And so there are some challenges there. The data for Indonesia is not perfect. I would like better data, more recent data, but I repeat myself. On the climate change, it will definitely have a massive impact, and on many places. With Deborah Balk, we did some research on looking at city populations and low elevation coastal zones, right? And there you can get an indication of, okay, which places are at risk now, which places will be at risk in the future. I'm half Dutch, and so if we just take elevation as the indication, then most of my countrymen are already at risk today. So the low elevation coastal zones have a limitation in terms of, you need to understand the investments today and potentially in the future in protective efforts to see, okay, yes, Venice floods occasionally, but they're working to avoid that happening in the future. It's difficult to integrate those into a projection, but it is useful to understand the scale that could affect the city today and in the future, also to justify remediating efforts to try and protect lagunas, trying to protect low areas with low elevation, especially if there's lots of people there. But I think it's not just a question of dealing with more extreme storms and sea level rises. I think also the changes in temperature and in climate more generally will affect a lot of people, and especially people who can't afford air conditioning and live in very, difficult circumstances. So for me, climate change is very real, never mind what the Trump administration says, and is already affecting a lot of people and will affect a lot more people. A big motivator of my work was to create data that the climate change community could use. And these projections we've done, we're the first team to have pulled this off, to actually produce globally consistent kilometer grid projections up to 2100. And so really encouraging that community to take our data and take it forward.
More questions?
Thank you so much. My name is Jofia Zador, and I'm not a student here. And I have a related question.
What are you?
Didn't happen. I'm an assistant professor at Northeastern University London. And my question is related to the previous question, because you mentioned that there are different directions to cities. Some are shrinking and some are going to be growing. And I was wondering what is it that makes a city grow or shrink?
In the interest of time, because I have quite a few, we're going to accumulate questions. So just remember what Sophia was asking, and then here we are. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Lucas, and I'm on the Urbanization and Development program. I was really interested when you said you found that there was no link between urbanization and development. And I was wondering, just in my head, if urban areas are more efficient in terms of how they use their resources, does that mean that there's also, what's the link then between efficiency and development if there's no, because as you said, there was no correlation when you use degree of urbanization between, there's no correlation between degree of urbanization and development levels. How does that relate to efficiency? How does that relate efficiency to development?
Okay, Heinrich.
Hi, my name is Heinrich Hirsch, and I'm studying local economic development. You talked a bit about the case of Rwanda and national definitions and how they not always align with yours. Are there any reasons that you can think about that countries might want to downplay the urban or rural areas? Is there any development aid reason that you could think of?
So back to you.
Let me take them in reverse order because this one entertains me the most. And this is no criticism of the other questions, but the anecdote is just fantastic. So national definitions aren't just descriptions of the territory, they're used for policy. And they're used to assign funding, and they're used to allocate services and infrastructure investment. And so if a place becomes urban or remains rural, this has an impact on funding. And so in some countries, rural areas get a lot of funding. So the local politicians really lobby hard to avoid becoming urban. For example, in rural India, you get a lot more subsidies if you're rural than if you're urban. And so if you're urban, you lose them. So there the fight is to remain rural. In other places, if you become urban, you're entitled to a certain school, you're entitled to certain healthcare facilities and infrastructure investment. If they can't afford that, then you remain rural. So, I mean, because those national definitions are so tied into rights, into governance, into funding, there is always pressure to move it one way or another, but it depends a lot on the country, which way that pressure goes. So yeah, no, it's a highly contested and as a result, also less accurate, especially over time, definition of the territory. Picking up on the question about what makes a city grow, we've looked at it in Europe. Typically, we find that larger places tend to have, on average, higher population growth. So we still see this shift towards larger cities. But we also see that regional centers, so the biggest city or town in a wider area, has higher growth or lower reductions in population. So the spatial constellation matters. It's not just size, it's also what's their regional function. And so we see that regional centers tend to have more services, provide that to a wider area, and tend to be better able at retaining or attracting population. But there's a whole industry looking at this a particular question, and the answers will vary from one country to another. But one of the things that I want to emphasize is, when people think about urbanization and the growth of cities, they typically emphasize migration. But we've done some research, and actually the main drivers of urbanization is not migration. First, it's natural change. And second of all, it's reclassification. It's population that used to not be urban, but that was already there, becoming urban. So it's the spatial expansion of the boundary of the city and adding the population that was already there and the population that then is born there or moves there. So those are, say, far more important factors for city growth than net migration is. And then to answer the question on the efficiency. So I was talking a lot about environmental efficiency, but using less energy is not particularly good for the economy, right? You're spending less money. So some of the urban efficiencies actually don't generate growth. Other ones do. You get more innovation, you get more productivity in cities. So in the principle, you would expect if you have more cities that you would be more developed or you'd be more productive at least. It doesn't always work out that way, and there's a lot of debate about why it doesn't happen. And part of that answer is that some cities, there is a large concentration of population in space, but they aren't sufficiently connected to create a larger labor market area. They're not sufficiently educated to allow for more specialization and innovation. So I would argue city can contribute to higher growth and higher economic development and productivity, but it's not sufficient criteria. You also need those other aspects, which are often missing, and then leading to lots of people, but in a very congested, difficult situation, where also corruption plays a role, the role of institutions. If you want a city to contribute to national growth, you better have it managed well rather than managed very poorly or very nepotistically. So there are a lot of other conditions that need to be in place. So just hoping that a bigger city will make your economy bigger is very naive. And you need to understand, okay, what are the constraints of my economic development? And it might be that if you cleaned up administration or you facilitated entrepreneurship, you'd have a much bigger impact on growth than just trying to promote more people living in the city.
Okay, we have time just for 2 questions, so just here.
Yeah, hi. Research fellow from Melanie Konomaki. A question I have that comes to my mind is related to the monitoring system. You mentioned you develop a framework. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Like, is your intent, are you planning a system that automates this process and really disseminates that information to the local authorities? I understand that it would be very helpful for them for cases that don't have the necessary resources in order to build the transportation system or what is needed. So what is your process on that?
Okay, and the final question.
Yeah. Hi, Robert Pollock, Canada Blind Fellow as well. I actually have 2 questions, but you can select one, and whichever one you think is a good wrap-up question. I was quite intrigued by your data that showed megacities. They grew from 8 to 33 and then kind of plateaued at 37. I was just surprised at that, so perhaps you can give some insight into that. My second question is somewhat more parochial and focused on Europe. You clearly identified the benefits of urbanization, the efficiencies of agglomeration. What do you think that might look like for EU regional policy in the next decade? But that's a parochial question, so you can duck that one.
On the monitoring system, I studied here in LSE back in '96.
Yes, I did.
I did RUPS. This is my alma mater. And back then, urban and regional planning was about good stories. You know, you'd have a case study about a city and it'd be a beautiful story and it'd be evocative and it'd be convincing, but there'd be very little data, right? And trying to get any data back then was super hard. You know, fast forward to today and we see an explosion of data. A lot of it not very good and you still need to clean it and you massage it, but there's a lot more, right? And so remote sensing for me is an area where we're at the cusp of shifting into something that can become used anywhere and become extremely useful. What we do at the JRC with Copernicus is we produce a huge amount of data that we then interpret and standardize and publish for free. And this is something we're committed to doing. We're trying to make it easier for people to get that data and without having to manipulate it a lot, also understand what it means for their area. So we're trying to produce data for municipalities or for regions. The difficulty we're still facing there is we don't have those boundaries. So one other thing that really pisses me off is you have all these public administrations with private boundaries. I mean, you know, put those boundaries in the public domain and then we can actually start aggregating it for you. Now, you know, countries are forced to kind of like download the data in their kind of private area and then apply the boundaries and then generate the data. And I don't think that's the way to go. So if we have public boundary municipalities, we produce public data for those boundaries, right? We do have a mechanism that other people can upload data for the boundaries of the cities that we've produced. That can be done in the Urban Center database. So that's one way we're encouraging that kind of exchange. But I do see a movement towards more public data, more sharing of data, and that would facilitate exactly providing people without the, you know, the geospatial know-how to understand, okay, the amount of land covered by buildings in my municipality has grown by 10% in the last decade or something like that. So we want to get there. We're not there yet, but we're a lot closer than we were a couple of years ago. Two lovely questions from you. On the megacities, you know, I alluded to it earlier. Natural change is what has been driving urbanization. And natural change is plateauing, it's shrinking in so many places. That's why we don't see a continued explosion of megacities. I mean, the story, it was a bit hidden, but we're not at peak urbanization, but we have passed the peak of the growth in urbanization, right? We're slowing down. It's not massive increases in city population anymore. It just inches up a little bit. And this is true whether you use our national definitions or the global definition. So the fact that we don't see that big increase is not that surprising to me because more and more countries are going to be shrinking in terms of population, right? And then for cohesion policy, yeah, this is my old love. I worked for 20 plus years for the DG for regional and urban policy. What does this mean for cohesion policy? There's a new EU cities agenda that is trying to acknowledge that the Commission was treating cities in a very, what euphemism to use, uncoordinated way, fragmented way, contradictory way. And so now there's an attempt to simplify funding streams and consider the specificities of cities whenever they make a policy. I think it's a laudable declaration, but I've been around long enough that I'm, you know, kind of wait and see what they will actually do in the new programming period. Not convinced it will all go smoothly. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, before we finish, I was going to use my prerogative to ask the very last question. But just very quickly, and before we conclude, but we've been brought up, many of us, to say that big cities grow faster, that size matters. The bigger you get, the more dynamic you become. And you had the graph with the link, and according to the old definition, that was the case. That seemed to be the case. Then you standardize the definition, and suddenly you find nothing, no connection. So my question to you is that does urban size first matter? And then why, and beware of what you reply, because I got a paper on this. This came up.
Familiar.
Yes. And the second, which is related, would be why do you have to convince anyone that having a coordinated definition and your definition is actually valuable?
Okay, let me try and answer this in two steps. I do think size matters for the level of specialization of a city and of its economy. Some smaller cities can specialize, but then they have to also be narrowly focused on a very small sector to achieve the same kind of specialization and the same kind of productivity. We have a lot of very productive places in Europe, and some of those are very small. I do think the scale matters, but I'm skeptical that we can, well, let me backtrack. My approach philosophically is that we shouldn't be telling people where to live. People can choose where they want to live. And I don't think we should be in the business of saying, well, this city should be a bit bigger and this one should be a bit smaller. I think that's, naive. I do think with government policy, we give a lot of nudges on where we make it easier to live and where we make it more expensive to live. I think a lot of those nudges are not thought through, sometimes not even explicit. And I would prefer a situation where we treat places more fairly in a similar manner, at least. On the impact on growth, it is far more complicated. And also, I think that we overestimate how dynamic our urban system is. The urban system in Europe has barely changed. So arguing that, we can modify and this would have a substantial impact on growth, I think is also probably misplaced. In more dynamic locations where you do still see a lot of urbanization and you do see still a lot of population growth, I think it is a more legitimate concern to see, are we over concentrating too much in the capital city? And so if we see a country that is still going through urbanization, has a lot of population growth, I would be more inclined to worry about too much primacy rather than not enough.
Okay. Well, so thank you very much. I think we should celebrate Lewis and his presentation in the usual way. Well, thanks for coming. You're always welcome at the Canadian Lunch Center and at the LSE. Thanks to all of you and to all of you online for following us and coming here in such big numbers. There will be more events at the Canadian Lunch Center. They will be advertised, so please feel free to join. And before that, well, just keep on following us on our channels, which are either in X or in LinkedIn. We also will be posting everything in YouTube. You can follow what has been happened in the past and what will happen in the future. And looking forward to seeing you once again next time we're going to have a meeting. So thank you very much again.
Me too.